In this podcast episode, Joe Rogan hosts Andrew Doyle, a British comedian, writer, and commentator known for his sharp critique of contemporary cultural and political issues. The conversation traverses a wide range of topics, including the rise and consequences of woke ideology, free speech, censorship in the UK versus the US, the manipulation of language, and the erosion of civil liberties. They also discuss the interplay between culture wars and politics, explore conspiracy theories and historical revisionism, address concerns about AI and social media, and delve into immigration, law enforcement, and political dynamics in both America and the UK. Andrew Doyle opens by reflecting on the 6 years since his last conversation on Rogan's show and how much has changed, especially following the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and social upheavals like Black Lives Matter and the Trump presidency. He describes the woke movement as the latest expression of a deep-seated authoritarian tendency within human nature, an impulse to silence dissent under the guise of inclusivity and kindness. Doyle argues that woke ideology, while ostensibly advocating for compassion and equity, often uses language to disguise exclusion and impose ideological conformity. This misuse of language has legitimated practices that many would have previously found alarming, such as child gender transition surgeries and the undermining of core free speech principles like the First Amendment. He emphasizes the pendulum nature of politics. Authoritarianism can erupt from any side of the spectrum if societies aren't vigilant, and warns that the consequences of overcorrection can swing dangerously into illiberal territories. The woke movement's violent enforcement mechanisms, such as shouting down opponents and weaponizing fear, are signs of its intellectual fragility, incapable of logical defense. Doyle stresses that society failed to be vigilant against the authoritarian threat masked in progressive rhetoric. A significant portion of the discussion contrasts the UK's approach to free speech with that of the United States. Doyle highlights the staggering statistics of over 12,000 annual arrests in the UK for social media posts, many of which are for tweets or memes that are far from genuinely threatening or violent. The UK's obscenely vague legal standards, such as laws prohibiting grossly offensive speech or causing needless anxiety, grant authorities broad powers to censor and prosecute, creating an environment hostile to free discourse. Examples include arrests over humorous or satirical content, such as memes comparing pride flags to swastikas or jokes about immigration, and outrageous prosecutions like that of a woman sentenced to prison for a deleted momentary tweet expressing anger over asylum seeker housing. Unlike America's constitutional First Amendment protections and the Brandenburg test, which requires speech to be intended and likely to cause imminent violence for prosecution, the UK relies on subjective measures of offense. This has led to societal self-censorship, fear, and artistic suppression, especially in areas like theater and comedy. Doyle warns how this has stifled creativity, citing comedians and writers who have faced cancellations and arrests for remarks that would be protected speech in America. Doyle delves deeper into how woke ideology weaponizes language to invert meanings, turning concepts like equity into a tool for unequal treatment, gender-affirming care into support for what he describes as pseudoscientific beliefs, and being kind into a veiled threat of social or legal punishment if one disagrees. This results in a culture where activists command kindness or else, creating an atmosphere of intimidation rather than genuine dialogue. The silencing tactics mirror those seen in childhood disputes or authoritarian regimes where logic fails. Doyle also critiques institutions like the BBC, which he believes have been ideologically captured, stripping objectivity and fairness, highlighting examples such as editorial vetoes on critical stories and manipulated political clips. Such media manipulation feeds growing mistrust in mainstream narratives. Social media's role as both a tool for free expression and a battleground for censorship is explored at length. Doyle mentions how memes have become frequent grounds for prosecution in the UK, with individuals spending weeks in prison for posts that hardly constitute criminal activity. The policing extends beyond speech to non-crime hate incidents, meaning people can be investigated or punished for their opinions or jokes. The UK's approach even pressures pub owners and employees to report offensive banter, reflecting a zero-tolerance approach to discord in everyday life. He also touches on the absurdity of police databases cataloging jokes and the chilling effect this has on urban discourse. The weaponization of the legal system to control speech is seen as a manifestation of ideological capture of the civil service and law enforcement. The conversation pivots to political biases in the media, the relentless misinformation campaigns surrounding figures like Donald Trump, and the erosion of truth in public discourse. Doyle critiques the left and right for abandoning intellectual honesty, noting how in the past, organizations like the ACLU famously defended free speech even for Nazis, whereas now some activists on the left push censorship. They discuss how the British public broadcaster, the BBC, has manipulated political clips, notably Trump's speeches, to shape narratives and fuel division. Doyle points out the dangers of media misrepresentations becoming the perceived reality regardless of later corrections, leading to ongoing societal polarization and escalating culture wars. Andrew Doyle shares insights into historical conspiracies and revisionist theories he has encountered, using Shakespeare authorship conspiracies as an example of intense, often irrational devotion to alternative narratives with little to no evidence. He describes various wild theories, such as Shakespeare being a black woman or aristocrats, highlighting that these attempts often stem from snobbery or political motivations rather than facts. Doyle also discusses CIA involvement in 1960s counterculture, referencing Laurel Canyon musicians, suggesting nuanced influence rather than grand conspiracies. He ties this to the broader theme of how distrust in institutions and official narratives fuels conspiratorial thinking, often exacerbated by social media's echo chambers. The evolving landscape of AI and social media moderation is critiqued, focusing on censorship and bias embedded in AI systems like ChatGPT and Grok. Doyle recounts how AI sometimes suppresses information on politically sensitive topics, imposing ideological filters consistent with corporate or government interests. He contrasts this with how older technologies or even alternative AI platforms provide less filtered information, allowing a wider range of content. They also discuss the growing community-driven fact-checking on social platforms like Twitter, X, which counters misinformation but also challenges traditional media's authority and leaves legacy media unsettled. The raids against Twitter offices in countries like France as a reaction to controversial content exemplify the global push against online free expression. Doyle and Rogan examine how identity politics and transgender ideology affect social discourse, law, and culture. They critique how the transgender movement has, in Doyle's view, become authoritarian, leading to legal battles where biological sex is denied or redefined, impacting women's spaces in sports. Examples cited include Australian legal cases forcing inclusion of trans-identified males in women-only spaces and the detrimental impact of pediatric gender clinics on same-sex attracted youth, equating transition treatments to conversion therapy in some instances. The guests note the social and psychological harm of hastily implemented gender-affirming medical procedures on minors and speculate on the positive ripple effect lawsuits might have in curbing reckless medical interventions. They also mourn the loss of reasoned discourse on these sensitive topics and the damage done to broader LGBT support as backlash grows. The dialogue raises concerns about immigration policies and political corruption, especially within the UK, but also touching on the US. Doyle recounts large-scale immigration failures, including unvetted migrants increasing crime rates and societal tensions. He highlights the UK's grooming gang scandals and politicians' inadequate responses, which have eroded public trust. The discussion touches on the role of policing agencies that ignore government directives amid ideological capture, with systemic refusal to enforce immigration laws or respond effectively to related crime. They compare the political environment in the UK, where both major parties have been complicit in ineffective or harmful immigration policies, to the US, where Trump's administration attempted to address these issues despite deep institutional resistance. Surveillance, government complicity, and election interference through demographic engineering are also examined through the lens of systemic decay and political gamesmanship. Doyle and Rogan analyze the trend of revising history and cultural narratives to fit ideological agendas. They critique casting choices in film and theater that prioritize identity politics over historical accuracy and storytelling coherence, such as rumors about Helen of Troy being portrayed by a black actress or anachronistic diversity forced into historical dramas. The consequence is a detachment from authentic engagement with history, creating cultural artifacts that feel more like preachy sermons than art, ultimately alienating audiences and fostering cynicism. They view these moves as symbolic of a broader impulse to tear down cherished Western cultural icons and legacies. Doyle discusses how social media enables the spread of fringe ideas, conspiracy theories, and radical beliefs, with some users exhibiting signs of worsening mental health or susceptibility to disinformation. Personal anecdotes underscore how individuals can spiral into delusional thinking, fueled by online echo chambers. He acknowledges the allure of knowing hidden truths and notes that blurred distinctions between fact and fantasy threaten social cohesion. Yet he remains hopeful that intellectual curiosity and rational discourse can prevail among most people when given the chance. Andrew Doyle talks about his satirical persona, Tatiana McGrath, as a vessel for skewering the excesses of woke culture and identity politics. He explains how satire exposes the absurdity of ideological extremes and mocks rigid political correctness. Despite being widely followed and occasionally mistakenly embraced as genuine by some, Doyle laments decreasing freedom for comedians and artists under increasing cultural censorship, especially in the UK, where comedy clubs are closed or shows cancelled for offending activists. He contrasts this with the more open environment in the US, specifically Austin, where comics can be more creative and less constrained by prevailing orthodoxies. The erosion of humor and satire is presented as a warning sign of deeper societal malaise. Toward the end, they speculate on humanity's future relationship with artificial intelligence and the potential for cyborg-like enhancements. Doyle imagines AI boosting cognitive function by providing instant access to information and near-perfect memory. The integration of technology into everyday life is framed as inevitable, with debates around benefits, risks, and ethical considerations implied. They touch on scenarios where AI might rent humans for tasks it cannot perform, reflecting on the blurred boundaries between humans and machines in labor and social structures. The former UK political landscape is criticized for failing to tackle woke ideology and immigration issues under both conservative and Labour governments. Doyle expresses hope in the emerging third-party reform, led by Nigel Farage, which he sees as a reactionary corrective to the entrenched, ideologically captured duopoly. Public disenchantment with leaders like Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson fuels demand for change, especially on immigration and national identity. In contrast, the American political system provides more avenues for pushing back via elections, as seen in Donald Trump's upset victories and policy changes. However, concerns about integrity of elections, media bias, and growing authoritarian tendencies in both countries underscore the fragility of democracy. The internet is characterized as a double-edged sword, on one hand enabling unfettered communication, independent journalism, and platforms for dissenting voices, on the other, facilitating misinformation, polarization, and ideological echo chambers. Attempts by governments, corporations, and supranational bodies like the EU to regulate or censor online content are framed as efforts to control these disruptive dynamics, but also as threats to free expression. Community-driven fact-checking and social media moderation are evolving, but remain contentious, emblematic of broader societal struggles over truth, power, and technology. The podcast closes with reflections on the widening divide between different social and political groups, the breakdown of shared realities, and the difficulty of restoring rational debate. Doyle describes current protests and violence as symptoms of disconnected parallel worlds unable to understand or tolerate each other. He acknowledges the challenge of rebuilding trust and dialogue, but stresses the importance of fighting for free speech as a cornerstone of civilization. The cultural, political, and technological battles underway will determine whether societies can regain cohesion or spiral into entrenched chaos and authoritarianism.